Hello, my name is Wyatt, and this is Cycle 8 of DSU's Security Tool Development course for summer 2025. Apologies for the poor audio and video. I am traveling this week, but I'd still like to show you all the project that I worked on this cycle. So during the last cycle, I got a lot of questions about how I stored the API keys for my project that I called Bitly Typos, which was essentially a URL shortener typo generator for those of you who didn't review it. So I originally stored the API key in a getIgnored text file, and I thought this was a generally standard practice, and it does seem like it is for personal API key use. But some of my classmates suggested to me to use environment variables, to use secrets, to use other methods. So considering that I got questions about this in Cycle 2 when I first published my URL shortener typo tool, and then the subsequent cycles when I improved upon this tool, I decided that I would dive deeper into API security and look at creating a sort of like an explainer between the three common methods of storing API keys that we discussed and the differences between them, and then have a short demonstration with the CTF challenge. So for this cycle, this is a CTF challenge I created. Essentially, it is a Docker container that hosts a website that contains an exposed API key in Google Maps. And I'll go into all of this later. So that API key is exposed, and it shows that there is a flag for the CTF challenge there, just to show that you've discovered the exposed API key. But going on from that, which would be the easy challenge, to the more medium level difficulty challenge, I would say, is the link pointing you to a new website, or a new web page on the same website, the APISec-medium.html page, which will give you SSH credentials to log into the Docker container and then do some exploring in the file system, where the user should be able to discover the three components or the three ways to store API keys that seem common to me based on my browsing around with the GitHub and the internet in general. So the first one is in a .getignore file. The second one is in environment variables, and the third one is in a secret on the system, which was a little bit more complicated due to my use of Docker, which I'll go into later, but we'll just say that's where it's stored for now. I included a sample compose.yaml file to start up my Docker container. I prefer to use Docker Compose. Many people just prefer to run Docker in the command line, and that is just fine as well. But this is a sample compose.yaml file if you'd like to run it this way. So my main ideas here are that in a web application, API keys should never be stored in a manner that is accessible to the clients, such as I do in the HTML file that is the original dropping point for this challenge. The other one is that there are multiple ways to store API keys on the system, each offering different levels of protection. I went into the three of these above. They are the getIgnored text file, which seems to be the most common. It's the simplest way to do this, but it's also the least secure, considering that the file is stored on disk and there's a potential that there's no access protections on it. You can adjust these access protections for a little bit of extra security, but again, the file is still stored on disk, and any type of imaging of that disk will probably result in somebody obtaining that API key. Of course, this should still be fine for personal use. I can't imagine where this would be a concern for a personal user at this point, but it's just something to keep in mind. Environment variables are a little bit more secure, but in a different manner. They're not stored on the disk, they're stored in memory, so therefore they can't be pulled off the disk in some other way if somebody did want to obtain API keys from you in that manner. But they are accessible to everyone on the system, so that is a concern, considering that they're not exactly, they're more secure, but they're not exactly private to individuals that have legitimate access to the system anyway. And then finally, the secrets manager is the keyring. Those two are probably, well, the same thing, but they're probably the most secure, but also the most, not the most challenging, but a more challenging method to storing API keys, considering that they rely on the operating system components. That leads into my third main idea, and something that I learned while implementing this in Docker, considering that I write most of my CTF challenges in Docker in anticipation that I might use them in a CTF later on. Docker containers, I found out, don't implement dbus, which is required for secrets management to work on Linux. So for this container, since I wanted to maintain the realism of working in an actual Linux file system for the CTF challenge, I essentially implemented a script that takes the place of the Linux secret tool and only has the one command required to obtain the secret that will host the flag. But Docker recommends you use secret mounts, which I have listed, or I've hyperlinked here in the event that you're interested in looking into that further, which is why they do not implement, well, one of the many reasons why dbus and the secrets manager is not implemented on Linux. So for my future direction, I realized while creating this challenge that it is possible for a user to circumvent some of the, well, not really circumvent, but essentially gain access to the flag pieces for the medium challenge and for the easy challenge, but mostly for the medium challenge in a way I didn't intend, where they can just grep the file system for most of these, as I had to store them, as many of them are stored in files intentionally, but then others, such as the one where I had to essentially redo the secret tool to be a script, that's also stored in a bit more of a file-like way and less protected than it otherwise would be, so which means it's not immune to individuals just grepping the entire file system looking for the flags. So that's not something that I want to encourage, as it doesn't really teach you anything. So I'm going to hopefully create a different user with a reduced shell that limits access to more advanced tools that users won't need for the challenge, specifically grep. And the second one, if I do turn this into an actual CTF challenge for a CTF that I'm running later this year, I'd like a way to monitor the commands that the users are executing, just to watch for any circumvention of the rules. So I'm probably going to set up a syslog client to forward the bash history of anyone who logs into the box to the syslog server, so that the team that's running the CTF and I can then monitor those commands. And I didn't really have any formal references for this project, but I did base my research heavily on the discussion that I had from cycles 2, 4, and 6. And then I do have linked some helpful articles that I read throughout. So now that I've gone through my README, I'm going to do the quick demonstration. So you can see I have Docker up here with my container. It is running. And so if I go to localhost 8080, you will see my website. And this is essentially where I'm leaking the API key. So if I inspect, and then check out this map, the map container, I see an interesting string here. So it includes the key and then ... flag, oops, API key exposed. And then an interesting other parameter called challenge, which says medium, you enter the flag into the system and go to /API stack medium, which then provides the credentials. So if I take these credentials, I log in, at host 2222 with that password. I can then look in var www html, which is where nginx is. If I do a list all, I can see a .getignore file there. And then I see that there is one entry in here. Realistically, it wouldn't be a file outside of the repo itself, but I'm doing this in order to kind of throw off anybody who is using grep again. So if we count that file, we can see the flag part, or the first part of the flag. Right there. And so that's not too much more of a stretch. Then, if we look for the second piece of the flag, the other common location to store environment variables, or store API keys using environment variables with a grep for flag. We can see flag part 2 is stored in the environment variables. And finally, the secret tool. I did have to write my own secret tool, so I did. I also created a little man page that essentially says this is supposedly giving you XNOM keyring, or so you think. And for example, if you wanted to retrieve the final piece of the flag, you'd use this syntax. So if I do secret tool lookup flag, I will see flag part 3. And then a user can combine all of these 3 flag parts and enter them into the scoring system. And that is my challenge. Thank you so much for listening to me this week. I hope to see and read all of your feedback, and I will see you again in the next cycle.